Welcome everybody to another Developer Livecast here on the Game Wisdom channel. I am of course Josh Spicer, and we got a great one for you today. We're going to be catching up with Failbetter Games, who are the makers of course Fallen London, Sunless Sea, and Sunless Skies, and discuss kind of the evolution the studio has taken in terms of adding more gameplay related elements to its design. But joining me tonight from the studio, please welcome Chris Gardner and Liam Mcdonald.
Hello.
Hey guys, it's great to talk to you. How are you doing?
Yeah, good, thank you.
Yeah, great. Thanks for having us.
Not a problem. I know, Chris, we've been talking to each other for like the last, 5-6 years on and off. I think
probably more, isn't it? It's like 7 or something. It's a lot. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And I think you came during our time where basically every podcast turned to Dark Souls at some point. It had to have a Dark Souls.
Has that stopped now?
I'm afraid it has. Although we may bring it back for Sekiro if you play that one yet.
a little bit before I got scared.
All right, good. Well, we can dedicate an hour to that at some point. But it's great to talk to you again, Chris. Liam, did we? I know I spoke to a Liam when during Sunless Sea. I'm not sure it was you or not.
No, that was probably Liam Welton.
Yeah. Okay.
Since left the studio, I took his name forcefully when he left.
Yeah.
I snatched it from him on the way out the door.
Did you battle him for it at all?
No. I think it returned to me quite naturally. The name came back, and I cuddled it in a dark closet and made my excuses and became the only Liam at the studio again.
Great. I have, when we do our podcast, I have another guest named Josh on, so we call him Other Josh because he can't take my name. No, there can only be one true Josh here on the cast. But it's great to talk to you, Liam, and again, it's great to catch up with you, Chris, and we got a lot to talk about. So, for people who are tuning in for the first time, could you both kind of go over what your roles are at Failbetter?
So I'm narrative director, so I'm in charge of kind of overall story direction, setting the narrative tone and the kind of the key and the fundamental lore of the game, and I write briefs for writers and freelance writers, and I'll work with them on their pitches, and then I'll kind of review all the work before it goes in. And I worked on a number of the kind of more narrative systems in the game as well, so things like the character progression system and the trade system as well.
Okay.
And I'm a developer that's predominantly programming. I joined during early access to Sunless Sea and went on to be the lead programmer on Garner, our expansion to Sunless Sea. In Skies, I've been doing still predominantly programming, but with little bits of design that I'm sure we'll get to talk about tonight. And I cover everything from implementing large bits of tech to working with different designers on their specs and the best way to get the most out of our tech, to actually pushing the builds live and implementing how our DLC works, and just everything that you could think of tech-wise, I will have a hand in somewhere.
I would say more than little bits of design as well. So one of the things Liam does is when we're designing our map is procedurally generated. It's like a bunch of different tile segments that are shuffled around each time you play. But each segment is a tightly designed sort of nugget of content. And the layout of the path through it, and the spawning of the monsters and the discoveries and the placing of the ports, all that kind of stuff, especially the kind of spawning and that kind of creating a player journey within the segment, that's something that Liam does.
Okay. And yet, as we're going to talk about over this cast, Failbetter has certainly evolved over the last few years. Again, I know when we last spoke, I think one of our first casts, Chris, that you were there, I think relatively at the beginning. You worked on Fallen London, right? And for people watching us who did not play that, could you kind of give them the elevator pitch for what it is?
So Fallen London is a browser-based game set in the same universe as Sunless Sea and Sunless Skies. It's all set in the city of London, about 30 years after it's been dragged below the surface of the Earth by bats and is now located a sort of short boat trip away from hell. And it's so it's a browser-based game, so it's a thing. It's all done through. It is entirely text. It's kind of like a vast MMO version of a choose-your-own-adventure book, where you start out in this city and then it's sort of opened up before you, and you have all sorts of wacky or weird adventures in it.
And for like the new people watching us right now who heard that description of what happened to London, that's not the weirdest thing that happens in that game. By no means. There's so much more.
It's a pretty weird setting, yeah, which gave us, which was quite a big challenge when we came to do Sunless Skies, which again is taking it into an even weirder bit of the setting, rather than a bit of the setting that's easier to understand. It's quite a lot to try and package up for people, I guess.
And I know I did a podcast, I think, with two other members of Failbetter. I think this was 2017, maybe 2018, somewhere around there. And we kind of talked about the narrative and the writing, or specifically the storytelling that goes on at Failbetter. Because as you said, with Fallen London and to the Sunless series, you are pretty much taking all these like self-contained little stories, these little vignettes, and then building them around this greater narrative of the lore or that world that takes place there.
Yes, yeah. So one thing we don't really do much of is sort of linear stories where this character starts in this situation, has a bunch of setbacks, comes back and is victorious. The stories in our games tend to be smaller kind of stories of particular situations or characters that then together help create a developing picture of the world itself, and kind of the bigger mysteries of the setting. And I think the mystery is a kind of big thing that draws people to our settings. So we're always establishing new mysteries and ensuring we know what the mysteries are, and then finding different ways to kind of see clues to them throughout all the stories that we're writing.
And like you said, like there's a huge bit of there's a huge amount of like continuity in terms of how your characters will develop. And I forgot I asked this question the last time I saw the Failbetter, but when you guys are writing like the various story beats or story chapters, like are you subconsciously thinking about, how is this going to relate to our next story, or to like even like a story like further down the road? Like, is that kind of like part of like your like storytelling Bible in a manner of speaking?
Yeah, I think the way we kind of approach breaking stories kind of comes at that from a slightly oblique angle, I think. So, for example, we'll normally establish a big kind of mystery or thing that's happening in the world, and then people will start breaking stories that tie into it. So it's not so much that when we're writing this story, we're thinking about what the next one is. It's more like this next batch of 6 stories are all going to touch upon this one big mystery in some way.
And for people new who are watching us, you guys have, of course, been very active with your storytelling. Like, how often do you put out new stories for your games?
We put out a new story for Fallen London every month without fail, because that's a thing that subscribers get. It's like a lengthy chunk of interactive fiction every month. We also do free updates for Fallen London, and festivals for Fallen London. So there's like 4 or 5 major festivals for Fallen London a year, plus free content, plus the monthly story. And then for Skies, we just released our first major update, which was just like 2 months after launch. Yeah, that sounds right. That was quite a lot of stuff. We could have sort of broken it into smaller bits and done little drip feeding, but it was all serving kind of one purpose, so we wanted to release it in one big chunk.
All right. I'm actually looking up on the site, so looks like you had the update Wayfarer on the 9th of this month.
Yeah, and Wayfarer was intended to address. How would you describe this, Liam?
I think it was an interesting change of pace after the build up to launch, and it was actually a really nice opportunity for us to claw back some of the things that we couldn't quite get into launch, while also tidying up some of the bits that we had wanted to work on more and polish more, and we had the opportunity to do that. And of course, we had a big redesign of the Albion region as well, which was really massive, and that sort of touches upon quite an iterative approach we've had to our segment design, where we early on in Sunless Sky's development, what we had was these areas of our regions, which we call segments, which were quite open spaces. In which you could roam quite freely and explore in any direction. And I think what we discovered over time was that made it quite hard on us to introduce interesting varieties for the player's path, and be those like discovery spawns or agent spawns. And actually, by introducing some tighter channels and a bit of tunneling, we had a lot more control over the design. And that is an area which we moved away from ProcGen slightly, to pull back some of the control. And so we lent into that a bit more now being redesigned, but we also just did way more pretties.
Yeah. And this was a thing where, so the very first version of, correct me if I get any of this wrong, Liam, because it's been a while and you were closer to it than I was. So the first version of the first region, it was like a big circle where you started in the middle. And where everything was, ports, discoveries, enemies, originally was all procedurally generated. So you could get two ports quite close together, or completely at the opposite sides of the region to each other. And we tried that for quite a while, but it just wasn't that interesting. And it turns out if you give players a wide open space with basically no obstacles on it, and they want to get from A to B, they just go in a straight line.
Yeah.
Because it's quickest. It's the best way to do it.
Yeah.
But it's not very interesting. And when everything's procedurally generated, we don't know where these lines between places are. So we can't put interesting stuff in the way to make that more interesting. And we kind of tried a bunch of stuff with different procedural generation methods to see if we could have that emerge, but it wasn't really working. So what we did instead was we took that segment and we divided it into an inner ring, an inner core, an inner ring around that, and then an outer ring around that.
A donut inside a donut.
Yeah. And then there were, I think, 3 segments in the inner ring and 5 in the outer.
Yes, yeah.
Is that right? Yeah, and then the central one. And then we'd say each segment was then deliberately designed, so we put this port and this port would appear in this segment, and you would meet this sort of enemy in that segment, and you would find this sort of discovery or treasure in that segment. And then the segments themselves could still shuffle around. The outer rings all had to stay in the outer ring, and the inner rings in the inner ring, but other than that they could all move around. But we still hadn't at that point done much to break up the fact that it was a very open sky. So it felt like each segment had more of a kind of story to it, didn't it? It felt like it had a bit more of a consistent feel. But the journeys were still quite straight liney. And
yeah, and I think that part of the problem there came from, it's not necessarily just about being able to have these paths and say, well, now we know we can put an interesting thing in this corner. It's also about identifying the optimal route and then balancing against that. So I wouldn't say punish the player, but you might add more frequent risk in the more optimal path, and add more rewards in the suboptimal path, but also some danger. And obviously something we're always trying to push at is just being on the edge of survival. And if you can always take that optimal route, then that's good. That's going to hide a lot of the really juicy content that we have there. So just by confining the space a bit more, it opened up more and more possibilities for us to design around what routes the player might take, and just limit really the amount of routes they could take, so that we could influence the design a bit more. And interestingly, there's some parallels here between Zamarner and Sunless because Zamarner was the first place that we really tried prop gen. And for anyone who doesn't know, the expansion was basically to take the open sea that is Sunless Sea and just put a sub-layer on it, an ocean floor, and just essentially build every tile of our game again. And it really was something we wanted to do early on was get an environment in there and get detail and be able to start placing things. So we looked at prop gen, but the further we got into development, the more we realized it just gave us less and less control. And unless you really are able to get the rules of your procedural generation spot on, it's very difficult to craft the sort of atmosphere that we really demand and that we had on the surface of the game. And I think we saw that in Skies as well. And there was obviously different challenges in there that were more agent related and spawn related. But I think it's something we've learned that while procedural generation is important to us, I think having a great deal of control over the aesthetics are really key.
Yeah, I think it's the word we use a lot is handcrafted, that we produce handcrafted games. And so if we've got some, even though we still have procedural elements in now, like where these segments appear in relation to each other is randomized. What is being shuffled is these handcrafted segments that we are confident in the design of. But that when we added that pathing to them, so that was like the third major kind of iteration. I say major because there were a bunch of different kind of takes on procedural generation and a bunch of kind of smaller iterations within these ones. But then that third major revision came a fair way into development of Sunless Skies. And so the way it worked was there were 4 regions in Sunless Skies, 4 different kind of maps that you can go to, each of them pretty big, some of them stupidly big. The first one was the Reach, which was the first region we released for early access, so we could get players' feedback on it. And that was initially totally procedurally generated. The second region was called Albion, and when we started making Albion, I think the big change from the Reach to Albion, I think, was in visuals. That the art department kind of went crazy on this space steampunk dystopia, and that's where they really started playing with the depth that we can see. Because parallax, we used a lot of parallax, and this is something we couldn't do at all in Sunless Sea and Submariner, because Sunless Sea, you're on an ocean, so the only thing to look at is the sea, and then in Submariner, when you're underneath, the thing that you can look at is the ocean floor, and you can put interesting things on the ocean floor, but there is one level of ocean floor. Whereas in Skies, we can have the background just drop away as far as we want. And so when we did Albion, the art department really started playing with that, and Albion visually kind of was like, whoa, when we saw it. It was a big step up. And when Albion came out, we were doing segment design for Albion, weren't we, Liam? So we must have done that, made that stage of iteration. But then after Albion, we made Eleutheria, which is our third region, which is a very dark, scary region where everything, all the mechanics and the kind of themes of the content are around becoming lost and sort of making the player, who is by now kind of built up a bunch of kind of expectations and skills, sort of pulling the rug out from under their feet again. So they're no longer sure that they can rely on the things they have come to rely on. And when we were designing that, we put in much bigger chunks of terrain to break up exploration, and some kind of inconveniently designed terrain. So if you kind of try to hug the terrain, you will often end up going into a sort of cul-de-sac or a dead end and have to come out again. And it generally shook up the exploration. It shook up the exploration a lot, and it made the player sort of go on these journeys and stop and turn around and come back, which when you're being chased by stuff is really bad. And there's quite a lot of things in Eleutheria that chase you. But that kind of was what really cemented in our minds the idea that we wanted even more to experiment even more with specific pathing. So that after that, we went back and we completely redesigned the Reach from the ground up. So the whole thing got redesigned as this sort of maze of all these segments that could link together, and all the art got redone. And again, to make use of all those lessons of parallax that we'd learned from before. And we did that. So it was like every time we did it, we'd upped our game in some way. And then we'd look back at the Ola regions and we'd go, nah,
it's not matching up anymore.
Yeah, it's not saying because we made Albion, we looked, said, that's not as pretty, is it? And then we made Eleutheria, we looked back at the other two, and that's not as nice, it's not as fun, is it? And then we redid the Reach, and then Eleutheria was strong, and the Reach was strong, but then Albion hadn't had the advantage of all these.
Yeah,
it had the visual iteration, but it hadn't had all the design iteration. And it wasn't where we wanted it to be, and it had lots of wide open spaces again, and it just felt a bit empty. So we knew that, assuming Skies did okay, that we wanted to go back and give it a really good polish and bring it up to the standards that we'd kind of iterated to for the other regions. And so that's what this has been. This update has been. That's kind of one half of the update, is that complete redesign of a whole region, which is a lot of stuff. It's a big bloody game. It's really big. And then we
involves a lot of resetting up as well.
So
it involves a lot of resetting up.
Yes.
He said on the third iteration.
So how much did you have to redo then?
Actually, this time not as much, but on previous iterations. But then again, this is really, I think, a crucial part of what we do well is working until we identify, for instance, when there's a core problem like that, whether we're just not getting that handcrafted feel that we want, and then going back and making improvements. And so a lot of those early segment design sessions we had, which typically comprised of like 3 different disciplines. So it'd be a member of the art team, a member of the writing team, and a member of the tech team. And we sit down with a single segment within a region, and we obviously would come at it with the narrative background, some art background, and then tech for both like design and actual implementation. And then we'd be creative. It was a really useful mechanism for getting these different disciplines in a space that they could work creatively together. Quite often, I think, when you're in the middle of development, you can get into a system where you've done so much sort of pre-production or production work that by the time it arrives at your desk, there's little room for collaboration. We do that well, but just having these sessions in which we could focus on that was really useful. But as we went on, we realized that this level design aspect just wasn't meeting some of those goals. And that's, as you say, I think it was in some of the later design sessions that we identified that, and then we were able to go back and just be unafraid to go back and do that, because we knew it would result in a much stronger game.
Yeah, and we knew we still got to use all that early stuff, that multidisciplinary stuff, because that's what kind of established what the story of each segment was. And sort of the sort of enemies that would fit it, the sort of discoveries that would fit it. So all that kind of got used even when the segments got redesigned a bunch. Yeah.
Mojo's asking about, we were talking about it before the stream, that the doors, it looks like there's an optical illusion going on behind you guys at the door. But yeah, a whole
Get
lot.
the door to open and there's this whole massive face to be looking in.
There we go.
A giant's
Exactly.
face, yeah.
But yeah, from what you guys have been describing regarding like that change in procedural generation, I mean, that is a topic easily worth like an hour or two in of itself. But it sounds like you guys start out just kind of going for like a more of a complete open procedural generated system. You know, everything can appear at any specific part of the map. And I do like how Chris was using his hands to describe things. Now I'm doing it as well. That's what we do here. That's the beauty of video. But it sounds like you kind of like focus it down these little like chunks of content. So like almost like a biome in a sense. That this biome will have, you know, this specific story, this specific pore, and these enemies. This one over here will have this specific set of circumstances.
Yeah, and that kind of fits how we do content as well. That In the Sunless games, you go to a port, and then there's a chunk of story at that port. So we used to kind of designing sort of self-contained chunks of content that then become part of a wider whole. And this felt like using that same approach, but for for level design, basically, rather than relying on procedural generation so much. It felt like a fairly natural evolution to me, I think.
Yeah.
Especially since our new tech allows us to put words directly on the game screen as you're flying around in skies. So when you land at a port, you go into this kind of interactive fiction interface, and you read prose and you make choices and you face the consequences of it. And in Sunless Sea, that's what happened whenever you docked at a port. But when you were sailing around the sea, it was just art.
There's a few logbook messages, I guess.
And yes, there's a little logbook in there, down in the here,
Yeah.
which would kind of tick up some messages as you crossed boundaries and stuff. But it was right down in the corner and out of the way, and people often missed it. Whereas in Skies, we ended up, and Liam developed a bunch of these systems, being able to put messages directly on the world as you're flying around, which looks weirdly awesome.
It's my favorite part of the game, man.
Really?
Yeah, I think because it is somewhat like that logbook system, except because it brings it onto the screen. It doesn't have to feel like a logged message. It can be a conversation, for example.
Yes.
But what it does really well is that we have lots of, and this is like a good comparison again between like Sunless Sea and Sunless Skies, because Sunless Sea is quite a static game in a lot of ways. The terrain doesn't move much, and a lot of the action happens when you're in the UI and you're exploring stories. But in Sunless Skies, we're really pushing the envelope on just bringing the world to life, and just weather effects and discoveries and agents with like flourishing animations and bits of environment that move, and different parallax layers. But something that was missing was the story. You still only interact with that when you were in dock, and there are, as I say, a lot of these states, like the war between tactics and stovepipes, and lots of other things that you might see in dock, but then you can be sort of chugging along and you're not reminded of them, and like that sort of that way of exposing the sort of unpredictable place to tell these stories, so that you're approaching a port and suddenly you're reminded of this state of the world that you've influenced and that is changing. I think has been massive, and they're often funny as well. It's a great way to just change the tone.
Because the way you build that system, it's quite powerful. So it's not just that when you pass this point, this message pops up. We can have lists of messages, so you'll see a random message from this list pop up. So every time you go to a port, you're not seeing the same thing. But also we can filter what lists it consults based on the player's status.
Okay.
So a common one we use, for example, is, have you got a certain officer on board? And if you've got the feline eccentric on board and you approach Lustrum, she might have a particular opinion on Lustrum. So that is added to the list that it considers to draw from. So we can have officers comment on places you're going to. We can even have officers comment on places you're going to if they're at a certain point in their story, which we only do a couple of times. It's very powerful when we do it, I think. But it's the sort of thing where you could just go insane on. There are already a lot of these messages.
Yeah, and like it's quite as you say, it's a really dynamic fundamental system that is applied in several places. Like another place it sits is, so you would only see it around you, but in tech terms, they're either placed around docks, discoveries, or on the player vessel itself, and that just allows you to sort of categorize the types of messages you're going to appear. So quite often when it's with docks, you are talking about officers and whether or not they're at a certain point in their story, but on the player vessel you might be looking at terror or fuel, or supplies, and that's like really important for the pacing and the ramping up of tension, because we've got all this UI signaling to say, hey, your terror's getting high or your fuel's getting low. But actually being able to visibly like have a crew member scream or something is way more powerful. Because then the player goes, "Oh no, that has drawn my attention to the perilous state I'm in."
Yes. Oh, that's why my screen is freaking out. Yeah. But also, even when we're watching the status of the engine, like your fuel status or your supply state, we also watch things like what officers you've got on. So when you're down to your last crate of supplies, there's like a list of messages that pop up saying you're running low on supplies or whatever. But if you've got officers on board, they get added to the list, and then they'll comment on it based on their personalities. So like your aunt can be one of your officers, and if you get down to your last crate of supplies, she kind of comes and sees you and says, "You realise this means there will be no more scones," and it's become a lovely way to deliver kind of character from our characters, and kind of reveal their personality a bit more. While at the same time increasing the variation that the player experiences when this particular situation hits.
Yeah. And that's very important because, as we were talking about, I think previously when we were discussing Sunless Sea, that there's always that challenge, and this also leads back into the procedural generation talk, about you have on one hand these handcrafted story elements and handcrafted writing, but then you have the gameplay that is a lot more open and dynamic. And it can be very difficult to sometimes get those two working. Chris Garrison in chat said that some of the best procedural generated games he's seen was stitch together handcrafted content in realistic ways. And it sounds very simple, but as anyone who's ever worked with procedural generation knows, it is a far different story. And it's very hard to get these two elements to work. Like, when I played both Sunless Sea and Sunless Skies, one of the issues that I ran into was I was getting basically like the worst luck in terms of where these ports were set up. It's like, go northwest, okay, but if I'm down here, northwest is all the way up there to get to this quest, while somebody else will be, okay, here's where you start, you just gotta go like right here, like maybe like 2 minutes out of your way. And it's very hard, when, again, as we were saying, to get these two elements to work. And I'm assuming this is probably a major part of our conversation, that again, with that handcrafted nature of your storytelling, that it took a lot of work to get that, and having this world be completely open, you don't know where the player is going to go next, to kind of work together.
Yes. And there's kind of a number of different ways we try to tackle that. One way is basically to throw content at it. So when you start out the game, there's a small number of initial quests that you will start with. One of those is always in the outer ring, so that means you've got an initial quite long journey to make, but on the way of that journey you'll probably discover at least one other port. And one is in an inner ring segment, so it's not going to be too far away. They might not be in a straight line. Some players might end up with both of those kind of in a straight line. Other players, they'll be in opposite directions, but it's not going to be like having to go back and forth across the whole map. And I think a couple of other things we did are we had this kind of approach of, I think I sometimes felt in Sunless Sea that those two sides of the game, the sailing around, fighting monsters side, and the doing interactive fiction in port side, they felt very different and separate, and when you switched modes between them, it's quite a big jump for your brain to have to make. It's like, right, I'm no longer having to steer and dodge things and engage in combat. Now I'm reading and making assessments of kind of percentage chances of success and fail, and what the consequences of my choices are going to be. And then when you finish that, you've got to jump back into your ship. And it was just, it's an abrupt change. It's two very different styles of gameplay, and it's an abrupt change between them. So one of the reasons we were so keen to do this system of putting words on the map on the game while you're exploring is so that you're never totally out of this reading mode. You're always keeping that up a little bit when you're playing the game, and it just kind of eases that jump a little bit, I think. And we also try to address that by putting narrative in mechanical systems where traditionally narrative is not found, like the trade system and the character advancement system. So the trade system, usually what trade looks like in this sort of games is each port has a market and they buy and sell stuff at different prices, and the game is about finding a port that sells cheap and taking it to a port that buys high. And that's how we did Sunless Sea and Submariner. And Submariner had intentionally designed trade routes that you could go on, that you could kind of optimize, and a couple of them sort of overlapped. So you could hop off one trade route onto the other, but they were predetermined trade routes. And we didn't want to, and that meant that once you know that route, that is a reliable way of earning money. Unless you get killed by a monster on route, as long as you keep going in that circle, you'll keep earning money. Which meant the amount of money we could give the player for it had to be fairly modest, or they'd run the circle a couple of times and then buy the most expensive thing, and there'd be no sense of kind of equipment advancement. So what we tried to do this time instead is we simplified the markets of ports drastically. So the hub port, the one in the middle of each region, will buy everything at a base price, and all the outer ports all sell one export, also at a base price. So if you just go to a outer port and buy a thing and sell it at the hub port, you make no profit. The idea is kind of selling stuff at the hub port. It's like trying to buy at one supermarket and sell at another. You know, there's so much competition, those prices have reached a stable point. And instead there's a system of prospects and bargains. And prospects are opportunities you hear about at a central port that says, this person over here in port B wants five jumbles of undistinguished souls, and they will pay a stupid amount of money for them. And then your task becomes, well, where do you know that sells souls? Go source some souls from there and then take them to the buyer and sell them and make a big profit. And the amount that prospects pay out is always high enough that if you just go to somewhere, an outer port that exports a good, and then take it to the buyer, you'll make an okay profit. But then that's partnered with bargains, which are opportunities that appear only at outer ports, where someone will be selling a good at a fraction of its normal cost. So you can always make money by finding a bargain, buying everything and taking it back to the central port and selling it, and that will give you a decent basic income as well. But you can make ludicrous money by buying a bargain and then selling it to a prospect. So if you can get prospects and bargains to line up, you can make crazy money. And there are very long lists of prospects and long lists of bargains, and you never quite know which ones are going to appear when. And as certain aspects of your character improve, it unlocks new bargains and prospects, more kind of profitable or beneficial ones. And when you complete a prospect, you get, if this person wanted 5 jumbles of souls, you can give him 3 and still make that money. But if you give him all 5, he's very happy and he gives you an extra little gift normally. And it you get a little snippet kind of resolving that little chunk of narrative, and you get some effects from it. And that can be things like, it might be like the happy gives you more money, or it might be that now he's prepared to do you a favor and he becomes a cryptic benefactor, a resource that you can draw on. Or it might affect the balance of the war that's raging in the region towards one side or another. And that whole system meant that we were able to get we could put a lot of story about ports and the region's situation in those prospects and bargains. That even though they're quite short little snippets of text, they're good ways to make the world feel textured and alive and like it's changing and moving. And the consequence of completing those prospects, the fact that it changed your qualities, also gave kind of wider ramifications to engaging in trade. So you might be able to make a huge amount of cash by completing this prospect because you bought a load of souls as a bargain a while ago and put them in your bank. But if you do, it will improve the fortunes of the side of the war that you're against. Like you've sided with the other guys, and completing that quest would help your enemies, basically. Do you still want to do that? Do you need the cash that badly now? Or would you let that bargain, that kind of profit pass you by? So yes, we tried to put story in places that it wasn't normally found. So you're more often kind of being pulled into a sort of narrative mindset, and you're not having to swap between two totally separate modes of thought anymore.
And as you said, Chris, like a very important part is that it is a dynamic system, that you don't know what prospects and what bargains are going to show up at any time. It's something the player can rely on. It's a system that they know it's going to be there, but they don't know how it's going to impact them. And that's a very big part, again, about trying to add in that randomness, or more specifically, that dynamic gameplay to it. Because, as you said, we've seen many trade-based games where this port will always want cotton. So if I just do this and this and repeat, I get all the money that I need, and that's it. It's just a very mechanical element to it. And
and it's I think realism's a dangerous thing to it because I think people think of that as quite a realistic system, that you've got these markets that reflect a particular situation in one location over another, but markets tend to be volatile and fluctuate a lot, and affected by current events, and a lot of those kind of market-based trading systems don't represent that very well, I think. Our system doesn't perfectly represent it, but there is stuff we can do, like certain prospects only appear when one side of the war has the upper hand, or when neither side has the upper hand. So there are prospects that will only appear based on the world state. So it's not so much that you players will be manipulating the world state to create a specific set of mercantile opportunities they want to exploit. I think that's quite unlikely. But it just helps establish a connection between trade and current affairs that otherwise would be quite difficult to do.
And I'll get a Chris question in a second. Just as a quick time check, it's about 5:20 my time. I know we were going to shoot for, I think we said like around 6 p.m. my time. So I just want to give everyone the heads up about that. Chris asked, I know Starflight 2 and Elite had a trade system like this. Did you study those systems in designing the system, or did you arrive at it organically through development?
I've only played a tiny bit of the recent Elite. The Elite I played a million hours of was the original Elite back in the 80s, which was pretty static markets. They could change a tiny bit, but it was a tiny bit. I think, if I remember rightly, if you took vast quantities of something somewhere, they wanted less of it, so the prices would fluctuate. But it was very minor and tiny. But yeah, that was very much the kind of system that I wanted us to try and move away from, and just to kind of try and crowbar story into it.
Okay.
I think there's an interesting thing about it as well. It also delivers a bit of both purpose and personality to the trade system. You're not just buying or selling good, but you're often interacting with an individual or a set of affairs. And like you say about pulling narrative into another system of the game, but much more than that, it gives you an alternate objective at times. You can have 4 prospects at any one time, and you can of course some. So regardless of whatever narrative you're currently following from port to port, there's a whole other system you can just sidetrack and dive into. And I think when you have a system like that actually, if you explore other ways to expand it, and that's exciting to you, it says that generally the system is doing something quite well. And I think it's not just that it's exposing narrative; it's that it's giving the player another purpose, which is much funner than just interacting with a shop.
Yep.
Yeah, it kind of overlaps the quest that you'll be doing, your journal-based quest that you'll be doing. Take officer over here, carry this passenger there, or whatever. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And like we said, like having that level of personality is a major part of kind of like the formula with going from Fallen London to Sunless Sea and Sunless Skies. Like it's not just the bait. It's not just like raw game mechanics. It has to be tied to the story, to the theme of the world or the setting. And speaking of, there's two parts of Sunless Skies that I definitely want to touch on for this cast. The first is the progression, in terms of player progression, I should say, of playing through the game. Because this, again, is definitely a far cry from Fallen London, which, again, it is browser-based, so it's not like the player is unlocking new game mechanics or new ways of playing the game. But from what I saw with Sunless Skies, and I think to some extent with Sunless Sea, you do get that ability of upgrading your ship. There is that sense of growth in terms of power. And I wanted to ask both of you, like, how did you approach that when we're focusing on the player growing, kind of either secondary or almost like I'm not sure what the term I want to use, or somewhat either separately or just kind of like in its own unique way from the story?
I think there's so many different systems at play here. But one of the ones that I worked on was the agent's AI behavior, and that ties into a learning that is attached directly to your character, but that is about understanding how the world operates and how the agents that you encounter operate. And each of them has a set of unique tactics and maneuvers that they will try and pull on you when you're fighting them. And that is a system that we spent a lot of time developing, and then just leaps and bounds ahead of the sort of combat system we had in Sunless Sea. And it's something that, again, makes use of the quality locks that we've taught in other places, like the ambient messaging. For example, an enemy can decide to switch up their tactics based on your current hull level or their current hull level. They can decide to ram you at a certain point, or when they're at a certain angle from you. And so as the player starts uncovering these different tactics, they're going to learn to survive better in the world. And that's a very hidden part, I think, of like the player's journey into being able to survive and explore the world and unlock other opportunities.
Talk about the bees, because I remember you you told me all the stuff that the bees track. We have enemy bees, chorister bees, which are just swarms of giant space bees. But I remember you told me, I said, the bees were really hated me today. And then you told me like a bunch of stuff that the bees will make the bees hostile. And it was way more sophisticated than I realized. It was going on.
Yeah, I might not remember them all off the top of my head, but for instance, and like this is a really interesting one, and something that we just couldn't do elsewhere is carrying nectar, for example, or another great example, the agent raft chaining. So if you're surrounded by a cluster of bees, because they chain what we call raft, which is effectively aggro, if you attack one, the others are going to swarm to you, and that's like a really important thing to learn, because it's about your decision about when you engage. And also in the case of the nectar, what you're carrying and how you're interacting with that agent and properties in the world that relate to that agent.
So nectar is a trade good, just to be specific. But if you've got nectar on board your engine, it causes wrath aggro in the bees when you go near them. And where we spawn bees, we also spawn a discovery called hives, which you can loot to get nectar. So we fill the area with bees, and then we put all this this treasure in there that basically will make the bees hate you.
There we go.
And do they respond when you're near their hives or something? Well,
Not specifically. They're high different aggro range from a lot of the other agents, so it's about your proximity to them, which again, this is another a rule that's unique across all the agents. They'll have a different proximity. So and the idea of that really was that generally bees should leave you alone, but if you get in their face and start getting very close to them, that aggravation is going to build up, and then they're going to start swarming you. And as I say, because that aggro chains across other bees, you can essentially aggravate an entire hive. And so that's something that you're not going to unlock in any way, but just being observant in the world and exploring, you will start to learn.
Yeah, that's a player skill thing. And a kind of player skill, just about being good at steering and aiming, but about observing the world and working out how to use it to your advantage and minimize its threats. Yeah.
And Mojo asks, is Failbetter named after S. Beckett's Failbetter?
Yes, that's right. Yeah.
All right.
Yeah.
But
and I think we have two other advancement systems. I guess we have we have two kind of advancement paths. We have your locomotive, and we have your captain. Your captain levels up, and each time you level up, you choose a facet, which is like a little nugget of backstory, which affects your stats. And you've got each facet gives you +5 to one stat, and then there's a choice, and depending on which choice you make, you'll get +3 to a different stat. And then those stats are used to decide what equipment you can put on your locomotive, and they determine your chances of success in the narrative engine as well, the narrative UI. But you also have your locomotive, which you can upgrade your locomotive to different models, also put different sort of equipment on your locomotive. You can put different weapons on there, different plating, different scouts, which, as I said, require different stats. And this time, unlike in C, when you died, you lost everything. You lost your locomotive, you lost your captain, you started again. And there were certain things you could do in the game that would kind of bank bits and let you pass bits on to your next captain, but only bits. In Skies, if you die, your engine is reclaimed and passed on to the next captain. So any advances you make, if this is your captain path on the right, if you die, that drops down for your new captain. Although you don't drop all the way down this time, you drop down. There's a formula we apply, so you drop a few levels normally. But your engine is inherited by the next captain. So each time you can upgrade your engine, you're like banking your progress for all your future captains, which is a big deal in a roguelike game.
Although you'll lose one random piece of equipment.
You will.
Because you can't just get everything.
Yeah. Which feels weirdly... it feels like less soul blasting. You're less likely to just say, I hate this. But it does feel weirdly spiteful. Like if it happens to be that weapon that you just bloody bought, or your favourite bat or something.
Yes,
it feels
That's my love right there.
We also have an actual bank system, so you can actually store items as well, and they will persist.
Be inherited as well. Yeah, so there's more kind of ways to safeguard their progress now than there was in C. That was a big. One of the things we heard a lot about C was there were a lot more people who wanted to like it than did, because it was so harsh and the price of failure was so vast. It could be starting everything all over again. So a bunch of our systems are deliberately intended to. We still want death to be a sting, but we don't want it to be just blasting. We want it to be recoverable from, and for you to be able to kind of play in a way that mitigates against it.
Yeah, it should feel like a step in the journey rather than the end of the journey that you're then resetting.
And dying sometimes unlocks stuff as well for your future captains. There are 3 ambitions in the games, which are like big storylines and win states. And when you create a captain, you choose what ambition you want. But there's actually a 4th hidden one, and you can do things in the game to find it and unlock it, but it unlocks it for your future captains, not your current one. And there's like if your captain dies, it adds new facets to the list available to your next captain that you can take to affect your stats. So there's like extra level up options, and if you manage to complete an ambition, that also adds a new facet that also does something else funky. Like if you complete the wealth ambition, the facet you can take is a bequeathment or an inheritance or something. One of the options gives you a big pile of cash to help get you underway.
Mm-hmm. And I do want to clarify, like as you were describing the leveling up system for the captains, that's again another example of you trying to marry the storytelling aspect with a game mechanic or a game system. I think the one that I really like was the one when you're in a mental hospital, and like the choice is, yes, I got better, I'm cured, or no, I just lied that I'm better, I'm still crazy, and I get those points.
This was kind of a big experiment and quite a big risk, but it seems to have paid off. I think people respond very well to it. I think one of the things I always struggle with in RPGs is I get like 10 hours in and then I want to change my build. I wish I'd chosen a different class right back at the beginning, and it's too late then. I'm not going back to the beginning of Baldur's Gate, but all them cobbles, so I can see what it's like being a mage. So we didn't want to front load lots of character decisions, character creation. We wanted to spread it out through the whole of the game. So the character advancement system, the facets are often things you are recalling about your past, like that you once spent time in a Victorian mental asylum, or you have a lost love, or you have a rival, or you were brought up on the kind of smoggy streets or in the fancy houses. And it means that you get that kind of sense of, you don't have to decide all these things about you can make that choice as you're playing through the game. And it's also a good way to get a bunch of kind of information in. There's a various kind of information about how the world works and how society works and stuff in there. And both the fun thing and the hard thing about them is, though the choices attached to each one, because each one only has 2 choices associated with it. So the asylum one you mentioned, the choice is either you're feeling much better now, thank you, you're sane, or no, you're exactly the same as you were. And one of those gives you sort of endurance points, and the other one gives you deception points, basically. But those are 2 quite deliberately chosen options. It's not like the options aren't you had therapy A and that made you better, or B and that made you better. And it's not you got better or you broke out. It's you got better or you learned to lie. And the choices that you exclude say a lot about the decision you're presenting to people as well. And these are all meant to be kind of quite provocative statements and questions. They kind of intrude a little bit on what we consider the player's rights are, and they intrude just enough to kind of poke you into answering this question and kind of thinking about it a bit. There's another one, there's one where you had a lost love, and the choice is, the question that it asks is, it says sort of, you loved, you lost, how much does it hurt now? And the option is an ache like a hole in the heart, or as red and raw now as it was then. There is no option to say, I'm fine now, actually, thanks, I've moved on. If you've chosen this option, you are still suffering from this. You are still in a state of grief. It's just about what form does that grief take. And it's interesting seeing people build the story of their characters out of these decisions that they make, because you kind of can't be very neutral on those decisions you've had to make. You've had to kind of commit one way or the other. You've had to kind of have an opinion on it. And if you're just playing for the stats, you can just look at which one gives you the stat, you choose that. And then you can kind of look back at the ones you've chosen and try to play this fun game of, well, how did this person end up? This person with the 8 tragic love affairs and the disgraceful scandal, who is a priest.
Yeah, and I think that's very interesting. I don't think we spoke about this yet, but like with how like character driven like Failbetter games are, like it does seem very popular, very accessible around like ARs or after action reports of people kind of like building a narrative around their character, or even the old idea of the role playing server that we see in a lot of MMOs.
Yeah, we get a lot of that, and our favourite reviews past as the journey of a captain meeting some appalling end. Set out from port 10 minutes later, had eaten my last crewman. 10 out of 10. My crewman. That's always a lot of fun, and that's a lot of the motive behind us cramming narrative everywhere. And when I say cramming narrative everywhere, I don't just mean putting words in them, but the sort of stuff Liam was talking about giving the enemy's personality and particular behaviours to prompt specific stories. Liam, talk about the Undeparted a bit, because that's a cool enemy.
That's a terrifying enemy. The Undeparted is our only invisible enemy, which is a good thing, I think. And it was quite a challenge to design. But the idea of the Undeparted is essentially that it is constantly hunting you. It's got quite a huge range whenever it spawns. And so quite often, and when it dips into close enough range to you, its invisibility will briefly drop, and you will get a glimpse of it, and then it will go invisible again. So,
or when you put your headlight over it, right? Is that right?
Yeah. So what quite often happens is the player's unaware of anything happening whatsoever, and happens to make just a quite unpleasant turn to go in a different direction and reveal a creature that they had no idea was there. And as soon as they're aware of that, obviously either fleeing or combat ensues. And it's an agent that enjoys getting very and then getting very far away and going invisible. So it's a constant battle of tracking the enemy, trying to identify it, see where it's gone. And it's so different from, I think, any other agent we have, but it's just that was one that personality took the forefront of its design, really. Sometimes we had particularly mechanical locomotives where we could do quite a lot with them, where we didn't have necessarily the idea for what the weapons would be like up front, and so we designed behaviors that we thought might be nice and say, this is quite a heavy locomotive, it should maybe ram that. It could be slow but have a very quick ram. But with the Undeparted, we knew from the outset what we wanted it to do, the levers we wanted it to pull.
But it's that behaviour combined with some other spawning design stuff means that it's kind of perfectly built to create little stories, because there are two other kind of relevant facts to how you encounter the Undeparted. The first is that when they are near, you can hear this kind of heavy rasping breathing sound.
Oh, that's good.
This kind of all the time. So you know there's one near, you just don't know where. And the second thing is that we have these discoveries called extinguishments, which are these kind of clots of darkness in the sky. And you can fly over them and interact with them. And they don't open a story, but if you basically fly into an extinguishment and look into it, you sometimes get something out of it, like a secret or something. But there's also a chance on every extinguishment that when you interact with it, it will spawn an Undeparted. But it spawns them invisibly. So what happens is players find an extinguishment, and they realise they can get things out of it, and they go, oh yay, and they start steering into all the extinguishments then. So the next extinguishment they come across, they go, oh yay, they fly through it, and they interact with it, and then an Undeparted will spawn. Now the Undeparted moves at about the same speed as the player does, but they have a very long range, so they will keep following you practically forever. So the player flies through this thing, and then shortly thereafter They get their treasure. They go, "Oh, I got my treasure." Then shortly thereafter, they start hearing this noise all the time, and they get a bit nervous. But nothing jumps out at them because it's still just following them along at the same kind of pace they're going. But then they see something else in the sky, like another extinguishment or a wreck, and they stop to loot it, which means the undeparted catches up with them. So the first attack from an undeparted is almost always when you're doing something else. So it's almost always an ambush. So that's kind of, it's a built-in story of the player's experience right there. Is
it's got a lot of similarity in Zabarna. Actually, there was the constant companion, which is a spider like creature that hunts you when you're underwater, and it has stages of alert. So the first thing you see is just glowing grubs around you, nothing else, no enemies, just these glowing grubs that are sort of throbbing and alive, and then the next thing you hear is sort of clicking of feet, little scuttering nearby, and you think that's a bit weird. And then the next stage, as your terror increases is for the constant companion to spawn. And the way its spawning works, and it's similar to that narrative of the Undeparted Return, is we pick a point at a sort of 45-degree angle behind the player and spawn the constant companion there. So as soon as it's in, it's behind you, and then the first thing it does is come out. And you can only then go in one direction, and it, unlike the Undeparted, is very quick.
Yes. Behaviors that make personality or tell the story of the creature or the region, that's where we've had the most success, I think. There are creatures in skies in Eleutheria called grievers, and in Eleutheria is a realm of darkness, and we wanted to make light a big deal. So whether you have it or whether you don't have it matters, and all locomotives have a headlight on them. And up until Eleutheria, it doesn't make much difference whether you've got it on or not. It makes a slight difference, I think, to aggro range. But it's quite subtle. And if you've got your light off, your terror increases more quickly. But in Eleutheria, we wanted to do more than that. So there are, for example, there are the Dowser engines, who are fanatical revolutionaries who will attack you if your light is on. And there are the Empyrean Outriders, who are their enemies, who will attack you if your light is off.
Oh, good.
So you have to recognise what enemy is around. And often you will find these two groups fighting each other. So you'll have to make a quick decision about which side you want to be on in that fight. But there are also these creatures called grievers that look like angry kidneys. I don't know. It's just these horrible mutants. And they're all asleep. They just float, just breathing slightly. In the
zombie Pac-Man sort of thing.
Yeah, zombie Pac-Man. And they won't do anything at all as long as you don't disturb them. And there are two ways to disturb them. One is flying too close to them because your dreams infest theirs and wake them up. And the other is shining your light on them. And what happens if you shine your light on them? They start to stir and they kind of open, and then they scream at you, and they charge, and they explode in violent ichor, and it's disgusting and horrible.
It's a very quick lesson to learn, though.
Yeah,
very quick lesson to learn.
And you tend to find them in little clusters as well. So you'll kind of enter this zone with a bunch of these things in. And the safest thing to do is to turn your light off and give them a wide berth.
Yeah.
But while your light is off, you're gaining terror more rapidly. And stuff. And it's that there's a bunch of toggles in Eleutheria about that make the question of whether or not you have your light on at this point. Is this the right thing to do? Is it not? Yeah.
So far we want to wrap or round things out here. So you have evil bees, demonic kittens.
Kitties.
Oh,
that wouldn't be scary. Demonic kittens. No, even demonic kittens are quite cute. No, they look like an internal that's been kind of scarred and stuff. Really.
And does the invisible? I mean, what was his name? The Undeparted.
The Undeparted.
Do they actually become visible when they get close, or are they just completely invisible?
Well, once your headlight's on them, you'll have made them visible for a short period of time, or while they remain in your headlight. So it very much becomes about tracking them, but of course they're moving towards you, and they're they have two main attacks, which is to swipe, and obviously they're moving constantly towards you in an effort to do that, or they will drop a small AoE effect that you have a short time to get out of the way of. And moving sort of backwards or sideways isn't the most optimal way to get away from the Undeparted, because they have a decent turning speed. So while you want to keep your light on them, you're actually encouraged to turn away from them in order to avoid their attacks.
Yeah.
Right.
And they look like sort of these kind of giant skeleton things with sort of lank kind of hair and tatters all over them. But the bottom half of them has been destroyed and eaten away, and there's just these kind of tatters of flesh streaming off them wherever they fall. They're really nasty creatures.
It sounds like the art team at Failbetter had a lot of fun with Sunless Skies.
That one especially, I remember sort of describing what we sort of imagined that could look like and talking about it, and then coming back to learn that they'd added tatters of flesh onto everything. Like, oh, thanks, art team.
Yeah.
And I think we invested a lot more than in any of our previous titles, which has just brought these behaviours to life. As I say, Chris talked through the Griever's stages of awakening, and all of that, it just comes from the sort of extra time the art team could spend developing the animations.
Liam, I'm sorry to interrupt. You kind of cut out at the start of your sentence there.
Was that we spent more time on animation, were you saying?
Yes, than any other title, I think, before, and that really shows in just the agents' personalities.
Yeah, because that also is part of their... That's how we often signal the agents' attacks and different attack types, is through some animation. So like before an enemy locomotive rams you, slow down and kind of orient, and then it will let loose this massive kind of blast on its horn before it charges at you and stuff. And the turrets, before engines' turrets open up, they sort of rotate and lights turn on and all this kind of stuff.
Yeah. All right. And I know we are starting to get near the end in terms of our time. I think we may go over by a few minutes, but there is still one topic I want to touch on. That is definitely the evolution of the combat, or the combat systems from sea to skies. And for the people watching, this will probably be kind of last call for questions for Chris and Liam. But one thing that I definitely want to touch on is adding in more of the gameplay systems to Failbetter's storytelling. Now, as we were talking about before the stream, that both of you guys didn't exactly start with Sunless Seas. Like, you came on, I know, Liam, you came on during the early access period. Yeah. And that was a major point, because I remember checking out the game during early access, and then kind of how it evolved near the middle to the end point. And one of the big design changes was the combat. And again, this is something that is not or wasn't really known by Failbetter previously. Again, with Fallen being browser based, there wasn't exactly this action based element to it. And even with the original version of Sunless Sea, I think it was more of a turn-based, or it's kind of it was like a resource system. Like, you had to wait for your resource to charge up, and then you can do an attack, or you could do a dodge. And then that got transitioned into more of a movement or an action-based system. I think somebody may have described it, I don't want to say FTL-like, but more... it felt more of an action game than it did an RPG.
Yeah, more of a turn-based, I guess, would be the nearest thing. And I think part of that, I came on during early access and right at the Kickstarter, but that was our first real foray into sort of PC game development. Yeah. And so I think we were still finding our feet and actually committing to going from making a browser game to making this big PC game across sort of 3 platforms was quite a big deal. And I think that is one area where we knew that combat system was something we could design, and we wouldn't necessarily have to lean as much into things like the animations or displaying the different behaviors, or the sort of real variety of AI that we had the time to devote in Sunless Skies. But I think as development went on, we realized that we were actually more than capable of making a system that was funner, and actually the turn-based system wasn't really doing the job they needed to do, because you would often leave docks, find a creature, and then you'd sort of almost come to a halt again as you entered this interface, and it was just too much interface and not enough world, and you lost that that lovely sort of ponderous moment as you're moving from dock to dock and sailing through the world. And so having real-time combat was a way that we could get that back and sort of reduce the interfaces of it.
And the real-time combat in C was quite MMO-like, I guess. It was basically about cooldown, wasn't it? And keeping enemies in your firing arc.
Yes.
When you fired.
Yeah, you would only get... it's essentially a warm-up of your weapon, and the earlier you fired it, the less likely it would be to hit. But your various weapons, sort of forward, deck, and app, had their own sort of arcs of firing, and they would only warm up when the enemy was in that arc. So it was about your positioning in order to get those warm-ups to begin, and also your timing over whether you would take the risk on a shot that might not land. So it introduced more, I think, fast-paced decisions and the ability to duck in and out of combat without, as I say, slamming up against that sort of interface just stopping you and then leaving being quite a big decision. Instead, it introduced lots of smaller, more interesting decisions.
But it also had to feel, for want of a better word, boaty, because you were a ship on the sea, so you couldn't. Dodging wasn't really a thing.
You can't dodge roll in a boat for the people watching.
You can dodge in a train, but not a boat.
On a train.
Yeah, on a train.
Easy.
Yeah, makes perfect sense.
They were built for it.
Yeah. So in Skies, that jump was from that kind of more cooldown-based MMO system to direct control and direct aiming. You didn't have to the firing in Sunless Sea, as long as the enemy was in your arc of and your cooldown had filled up, you would hit. And if you fired before your cooldown had filled up, there's basically a percentage chance you'd hit based on how full the cooldown was. In Skies, you have to actually aim and fire at the and hit your opponent, and you have to dodge their attacks as they're kind of returning fire. So yeah, that was a jump even more, pushing that sense of direct control even further. And now we were off the sea and up in the heavens. We wanted people to feel a bit more kind of maneuverable and more directly engaged in combat. There was a thing that could happen in sea where your stats were such that certain low-level enemies would just become inconveniences once you'd passed a certain point. It's like Cliff Racer syndrome in Morrowind, where they're inconvenient, but you still have to kill them. And then other enemies would be drastically above you and basically impossible to fight. And in Skies, we wanted to make player skill a bigger determinant of that. So if you just sit and don't do anything against a lower enemy, it will still probably, if you can't hit it, it will still kill you. And if you're very skilled, you've got a better chance the higher level enemies. Although some of the higher level enemies are a bit unfair, so I wouldn't go too far. I haven't yet seen anyone fight. We have these things called the Logoi, which are these words of living flame that just hose you with area effect attacks. They're shocking. I haven't seen anyone like in a basic engine fighting lots of those yet. I don't know how that would work.
And like as you were saying, Chris, like when with that jump from sea to skies, you definitely saw more of that evolution in terms of the action-based elements. Like when I tried like on stream, like at first I'm like, wait a minute, I can actually like dodge now, and there's now direct aiming. And like we saying, it is like a very big jump in terms of what Failbetter has put out. I guess a question for both of you then, when you guys were working on Sunless Skies, were there any other combat systems you guys were thinking of? Or like did you have like in your mind that this was going to be it from the get-go?
I think this time we were pretty confident this was going to be it, but then we iterated on this a huge amount.
Yeah. Especially the feel and the sort of slide of the train.
Yeah.
We wanted a certain amount of stickiness, but also to be slightly uncontrollable in a way, I guess. So that you had to really plan your movements and then react to the movement you had just made. So the turn and the dodge, and so that lining up that shot and executing it was very satisfying. But also, if you missed, it was costly, and you had again all these interesting choices: continuing the engagement or disengaging. And it's not, you will be able to run away. You will be faster than almost everything you're fighting. But there are massive rewards for sticking around and finishing them off. So I think, that certainly the feel of the Perceptive is something that we are iterated on a lot. But I don't think we did much iteration on actually the shooting.
No, and again, the feel and the speed of the bullets, all that went through a huge amount of iteration. We tweaked around what heat did a bunch. I think at one point, if you overheated, were you just totally dead in the water? I can't remember. We tried a bunch of different things that heat affected. And we put a bunch of work into this. Was a lot of this was Paul did a lot of this stuff. The variant weapons types got a lot of attention. We had just your basic kind of cannon and shotgun for a very long time.
Yeah,
and then we added missiles
that detonate on a second click.
That you can detonate on a second click and and the different models of them have different ranges of those kind of qualities. Mines we added, machine guns, and then weird guns that are exotic things that you have to find in content. Ridiculous spruddy slime guns and things that shoot exploding words, and some of the enemies' guns as well. You can get a machine gun that shoots shards of glass, and one of the pirates' cannons.
Yeah, and it's an interesting difficulty curve because in some ways the starting weapon is one of the ones you have to be most precise with, and is most costly when you miss because it's a slower cooldown. It's not quite as fast. As I say, like the things like projectile speed and the blast radius for the blast damage of some of the weapons. As you get better and better weapons, all of that stuff becomes better and better. So combat is not only slightly easier in terms of hitting the enemies, but it's more fun as well. So you get to just enjoy the tougher enemies, I think, by being able to hit them more.
Like some weapons have better knockback. You can actually knock try and pin them against stuff. Yeah.
You can kind of see that evolution, like from beginning to late game, in terms of how much you can actually do or how the fighting actually changes.
Yeah, and all that. Yes, so this is a valuable point. I think all those extra weapons, we could only do those because we had locked down how the basic weapons were going to work, and we were fairly happy with how the basic combat worked. That then gave us the parameters for doing the advanced weapons and the weapons that worked differently and that violated some of those rules. And that's, as we were doing that, we could also add weapons to the enemies as well. So enemies can drop mines and have turrets, have machine guns and rockets and stuff as well.
Okay. And I have at least 20, 30 more questions for both of you guys. So I'm trying to be really careful so you both of you don't fall asleep at the keyboard here. I'm trying to think we have time. There's one question that I hope we have time for. Oop, hearing some static in the background. And I do also want to ask kind of what the future is for Sunless Skies is kind of our final question. But here's the one question I want to see if we have time for. We'll see how big of an answer this is. I wanted to touch on kind of the new player experience and how you guys have kind of tried to streamline things. Because again, going from Fallen London to Sunless Skies, it's completely brand new game system, completely brand new progression. I remember one of the issues I had with Sunless Sea was that it was very rough. As a new player, if you had no experience with the Fallen London universe, it was basically I go out, I die, lose everything. I gotta restart again. I die again. I lose everything, and I know that frustrates a lot of people. So again, this could be either like a 2 minute answer or like a 2 hour answer. But like, how did you guys approach again trying to make this very appealing to new players? Because again, there's again like for people watching who are fans and Brody, there's a lot of work that goes into these games. There's a lot of content, but it can be very hard for someone brand new to kind of dig into it.
I think there's a couple of aspects to that question. I think one is, how do we introduce the player to this big, rich, complex world? And the other is, how do we make the initial game not so kind of off-putting as Sunless could be? And a lot of people had that kind of experience where to really get ahead in Sunless, you had to kind of almost exploits. You had to find, there's a couple of specific quests and stuff that if you prioritize those, you could get some cash in your pocket, and then you could upgrade your ship a bit, and you were on your way. So I think one of those things we've talked about already is making the less absolute. So you're not set back to square one every time you die in Skies. The trade systems of bargains and prospects is available from the absolute get-go, and is kind of level independent. There were very good trading opportunities available to you from the start. So if you want to just focus on getting some money and upgrading your engine, you can do that. We changed how experience gain worked a lot. So you get experience for, I think, you get experience for 4 things now. You get it for combat, for trade, for completing prospects, for completing stories, and for exploring. Every time you find a point or a label or a point of interest or a wonder or whatever in the map, you gain experience. And because your captain automatically, this is another thing actually, in Sunless, if you died, you didn't inherit the map from your previous captain, and the world was generated again. You could choose to inherit the map, but if you did, you couldn't rediscover the stuff that was already on the map. So you were giving up all that experience that previous captain had earned. What happens in Skies is you inherit the previous captain's map and all the experience they gained from unlocking that map. So that creates a kind of floor under which your character, even if you died a bunch of times, you can't fall below this certain experience level. But we also built a dedicated tutorial section, which is one of the first times we've done that, really.
Yeah, and along with tutorial, which run past the actual tutorial section and with you as you're discovering the systems, the various systems, and they'll unlock at different points and are tracked by, again, the same sort of qualities that we talked about before. But that tutorial experience was one of the most handcrafted things, I think.
It really was. Yeah. So you start with a little story. You start as the first officer on an engine rather than the captain, having just returned from a disastrous journey to somewhere you never should have been. And you've got to try and and your captain has been injured and is dying, and you've got to try and get back to the starting port. And when Liam says handcrafted, I mean every inch of this thing was discussed and planned. So, for example, you start off in this in a fairly narrow, straight tunnel, and it tells you this is how you move forwards and backwards. And then as you go forward, the tunnel bends, and it says this is how you turn left and right. So you cannot go through this tutorial without doing each of these, doing each of these steps that you're being taught. Even something as basic as, we are going to make sure you steer. There's a point you can't get past until you've got weapons. There's a small, brief combat you can get involved in with a basic enemy, but that basic enemy, we've actually tailored how much damage it does and its behavior and its
we weakened it slightly.
Health. So it's easier to beat, but it still returns fire. And the the basic locomotive enemy, the Marauders, Paul tuned their shot range and speed perfectly, I think. So it's a damaging shot, but it moves fairly slowly, but it moves just fast enough that when you're starting out, all your dodges are like by the skin of your teeth. And it's like, oh, I just made it, and it just whistles past you by kind of a fraction of a pixel. And that was something that, again, Paul laboured at to get that kind of speed right. And we introduce discovering things in the sky. Like, you find a wreck in the sky, and you can interact and just take fuel off it. And that doesn't open the narrative UI, but it shows you this is how you interact with the sky. Then you have another interaction with a proper wreck where you actually go on board into the narrative UI and explore. And every single second of that is probably, if you know what you're doing, it takes to do that tutorial. It's really short, but every second of it was laboured over. I wrote 3 different story pitches for it. Adam wrote these are the operations we want the player to do: go around a bend, pick something up, go on board a wreck and interact and do skill tests, and then do harder, have a choice, leaving or doing harder skill tests but for a bigger reward, to teach that kind of the sort of consequences that we do. And then based on that, I wrote 3 different story pitches that could work, and we talked about those story pitches, and we threw one out, and we were taking bits from the two others and combining them together. It was, I think, the most intensely designed and iterated and developed bit of the game. And it wasn't iterated over a long time. We left it because we knew we wanted the game finished, basically. We knew what we were trying to teach.
Yeah, and part of that was, I think, because we had designed the Reach first. By the time we'd done all the other regions, we had to come back and redo the Reach because we'd learned so much. And so actually, in some ways, ending on that tutorial experience was really gratifying, because we knew that now we're setting the player up to go and explore this beautiful world.
Yeah, and we left that core bit as the very last segment that we did, didn't we? So we could build in the tutorial map to it.
Yeah. And once you've been through that, then create your character and come back. You have learned all of the core functions that you really need, including sending your scout out, which is the main way that you find dogs and discoveries.
All right. Yeah, and as we always say, like, it's very important to save that tutorial for the last, because if you try to build that first, you're not going to know exactly how your game's going to turn out, and that's another discussion right there. But
and we had to. A big thing was because it's this completely bizarre setting. You're in a Victorian version of space, but the version of space, it has atmosphere, it has weather, it has giant trees that rise up from below. It's not space as we understand. So it's a lot for players to have to take in. And so our approach was that we don't bombard you with all this information at the start, but instead we give you this kind of immediate emergency situation you've got to deal with, that is familiar enough that the player can find their feet. So your engine is damaged, get back to safety. Take command and get back to safety. Yeah. And that's enough. The player can, even if the world is weird, that situation is understandable. Yeah. So the player gets their heads around that, and by the time they finish, they've got some ground under their feet, and they've started to see some of the weirdness of the world.
And it's also gameplay first, which is, I think, really important. That you're not immediately, this is going to be a big narrative game. Lots of wonderful, did I say beautiful writing, Chris, in it. But the first thing we show the players, you need to steer this train, this narrow passageway, and get to grips with the locomotive. And I think it sets an important tone for the rest of the game.
Yeah, I argued so hard again moving character creation to the end of the tutorial, because it used to be at the start, and it has quite a lot of useful kind of world and setting information in there, and it does a lot to set the tone. And I argued myself dry to keep it at the beginning of the game, but I lost. I was outranked and outvoted.
All right. And again, we could sit here and chat for a very long time. I know you guys have to get going in the next few minutes, but if you're free in the future, anyone else from Failbetter, always happy to have you guys on.
Sure thing.
All right, so here is my final question then, and it's one that we always like to end on. So, what is next for Failbetter and Sunless Skies?
So Skies has done very nicely for us. We want to support it for a while. So we've just released our first big update, Wayfarer, which, yes, as we said earlier, kind of revamps the second region completely, but also adds a whole bunch of content aimed at making traversal more eventful and some balance tweaks as well. So you're more likely to encounter events while you're exploring, and there's more things you can interact with in the sky. Things that were originally spectacles that just kind of increased or lowered your terror. A bunch of those now have stories attached that you can interact and do stuff there. There's a load more stories concerning the gods of the sky. There's a whole system of critical damage. So if you get hit in a fight now, you can start to see consequences of that later. So you might get in a fight and then get hit, and then you're flying around like a minute later. You might learn that there's an unexploded shell wedged in your plating, and you've got to decide what to do about that. And can you get back to port and get it removed? Explodes, or will you try and remove it yourself now? All that kind of stuff. And we want to do more updates as well. I'm not sure what the next one, what will be in the next one yet. We've got a bunch of ideas. Which ones we're going to prioritize? I think it'll be fairly content heavy. And we will at some point we'd like to do a substantial chunk of DLC for it as well. Not like pay us £3, get a couple new ships. It would be a substantial chunk of story and systems. And the way we like to think about DLC is not just that it would add like another place to explore. It would change something. It would change a number of your assumptions game as well. So this is what we did with Submariner. We let your ship turn into a submarine, and then we added this whole layer underneath so you could go under the water, come up and down. There were different monsters under the water and different ports under the water. We wouldn't do something quite like that again, because to make the entire game, the whole map and stuff, and that was insane. But we would want something that in a similar way changed the core gameplay experience of how Sunless Skies works.
All right.
And there's actually, we've talked about quite a few systems tonight, the ambient message and the prospects and bargains and the AI behaviors, and all of them have such a massive sort of headspace for just
iteration.
Iteration poking at we can do with our evolving narrative, bring it to the player. And I don't know how often this is the case, but we're sort of post-launch and there's so many exciting things that we can still do. So I think whatever comes next is going to be pushing those systems in different ways as well. And I think it'll be really exciting.
Yeah, absolutely.
Great. So, since you guys only went from the sea to the space, I guess what's like the next environment you guys want to do next in the fall London?
I think we just have to do something different next time. I can't see another obvious jump from him at all. So yeah, I think it's going to be something.
All right. Well, guys, it has been a pleasure hanging out with you. Again, I know with the time difference, it is late where you guys are, so we're going to wrap things up here. But Chris, Liam, it was a pleasure hanging out with you, and it was great to talk design about Sunless Skies and everything. I mean, again, there's still so much more we could jump into.
Yeah, absolutely. And thanks for having us again. It's been great.
Yeah, it's been really good fun. Thank you.
No problem. If you wouldn't mind hanging on the Discord call for like 20 seconds when we're done, so I'll go over a few things with you. But we're going to end things here for now. So for everybody watching, it's either live or recorded. Thank you so much for tuning in. If you're watching this recorded and would like an ad-free and early access to this recording, be sure to check out patreon.com/YobuBicer, as VIP supporters will get that. I'll be back for regular game streaming later tonight as my voice is cutting out. And if you are somebody working the game industry or like to come on for a live or recorded cast, please don't hesitate to get in touch. But I think with that said, we're going to end things here. Before we go, for both of you, do you have any social media links, anything you'd like to plug before we say goodnight?
I'm at Gardner on Twitter. That's my main social media thing.
Yeah, I'm at W Goodspeed. You can follow me. I say from time to time and other weird things.
All right. So, with that said, folks, we're going to end it for tonight. So, thanks again for watching. Come back for daily discussions on game design here and on game wisdom, where examine the art and science of games. Until our next stream, have a great night.